Hello everyone. This is part 5 of my interview with former Scientologist and ex-Sea Org member Robyn Capella. We've covered a lot of territory with Robyn, and I hope you found these episodes to be as interesting as I did. There will be one more episode after this one, and these last two are the best yet. This week we're going to get into one of the most mysterious and secretive parts of Scientology, an area where few get to see what actually goes on day to day. I'm talking about Scientology's Intelligence and PR Division, otherwise known as the Office of Special Affairs, or OSA. Having been responsible for the most invasive and widespread covert operation in history against the United States government in the mid-1970s, under its earlier title of the Guardian's Office, OSA claimed to reform by kicking out its bad members and changing its evil ways. However, like everything else in Scientology, this was a total lie. They did not actually change even one comma of their operating policies, and many of those old Guardian's Office staff can still be found in OSA today, or doing its dirty work without being official staff members. After getting pregnant, Robyn was sent back to Mountain View, California in 1996 and took up the post of Director of Special Affairs, or DSA. This is a non-Sea Org job which is filled at local Scientology churches and which is OSA's on-the-ground representative. They're also used as errand boys and girls for OSA on bigger projects. For example, a DSA from the Bay Area named Mark Warlick was one of the infamous squirrel busters, sent to stalk and harass Mark Rathman and his non-Scientologist wife, Monique, in Texas back in 2011. Robyn herself was used as a gopher in court cases and to do other OSA dirty work, which we'll talk about in this interview. So, without further ado, here is part 5.
Well, I was assigned to be the DSA for Mountain View when I went up there to have my baby and be on classified work staff there. And essentially, the DSA is what they do is handle any legal matters, which includes, your real simple, non-corporation or non-profit corporation filings, making sure everything is being done correctly legally, interfacing with anybody in that regard. You have to deal with media, so any media handlings, you're supposed to deal with any negative media, you're supposed to create positive media, and that sort of stuff. And then there's the less talked about dealing with detractors, dealing with what are called squirrels, people who are practicing Scientology outside of the confines of the church. And you're supposed to deal with that as well. Those are really the main functions that you do as a DSA. Okay. And I spent quite a bit of time with the DSA for Stevens Creek Org down in San Jose. She would teach me, talk to me about it, show me what they do, how they do it. There were a few things that, there was a lot of, public relations stuff, little things that, you would do that, like she had a parade every year. She had a float every year in a big parade in San Jose, and that was a big thing. And a lot of it was pretty mundane and fruitless.
Okay.
Because you're sitting there trying to you're trying to battle negative press, and that's really, really hard. At the time, there was not so much of it, in newspapers. There was a lot on the internet, but we didn't deal with that really personally. That was more if there was anybody in our area who was considered a big, quote unquote, attacker, we'd have to deal with them, which means know about them, make sure they didn't come to the org, deal with picketers when they came to the orgs, things like that.
And it was the DSA over in Stevens Creek who taught you how to do all of these things?
Yeah, this was Darlene. She was the main person I worked with. There were references, there were, you would read like the PR series, which I had already done for a previous post. There were legal references on how to deal with, any legal situations, stuff like that. There were all policies, just sort of the regular known policies. I didn't really read anything special for the post. I think that was all reserved pretty much for the Office of Special Affairs at continental and international level. Mm-hmm.
How were you told to, I know you never had to deal with Anonymous, but because that was all after your time, but how were you told how to deal with picketers?
Well, the main thing we were told was to try to get them to not talk to anyone else, any other public, any staff, so that they would only be talking to us, and that would kind of keep them off of their lines. And in Stevens Creek, in San Jose, they often, at one point, they turned the sprinklers so that they would hit the sidewalks, and they would actually change the sprinkler schedule so that when picketers came, they would come on. And obviously, the picketers knew, this was done purposefully. We completely denied it, even though it was 100% the case. So, yeah. And we were told to look for any sign of any reason that we could to call the police.
All right.
To say that the picketers were, doing something illegal, any coming onto our property, anything agitating, things like that. So.
Okay. And which is sensible enough. I mean, if you have guys outside who are breaking the law, then
right.
There's certainly nothing wrong with calling the police on them. But at the other hand, you're talking about minutia now. They stepped a centimeter over the line.
Yes, I'm talking about minutia because none of these picketers were violent at all. None of them were really even that aggressive at all. They would just talk, and sometimes they'd yell snarky things. But that's it. That's the only level. And it really got me, one of the picketers that I dealt with a lot was Keith Henson. And I think it's fair to jump right into that because I didn't know everything that happened to Henson after I stopped being the DSA Mountain View because, well, I just didn't know. And I didn't realize that he'd actually gone to jail. I heard that he had a restraining order from when he was picketing up at Golden Air Productions, International Management, and that he had gone to Canada to avoid something, but it was all very vague and things I'd only heard a little bit about, and some reference to him having made a bomb threat, which to me, anybody who'd ever dealt with Keith Henson knew that it was ridiculous. He wasn't violent. He was easy to deal with. He was easy. I talked to him a lot, and he wasn't aggressive at all. There was just it was very trumped up, all of it, very trumped up. And I knew that the allegation of him making a bomb threat, even if he never would have meant it. And everybody who dealt with him would know that. It was just, oh, hey, we got him now because he said something wrong, Right,
tracking on that.
Yeah.
Okay, and we will definitely be getting to Keith. How long were you on as the DSA before Cynthia Kisser the Cynthia Kisser case comes across your plate?
I was probably about 6-7 months.
Okay.
DSA, maybe a little less, yeah.
All right, so really pretty new to the whole thing.
Yeah, and originally I was just called down to Los Angeles for a few weeks to go through files, help go through depositions, look for anything that could be used in the trial, basically. DSAs are, I think, basically considered a resource by OSA to use for projects as needed, and they were all the time, and I was on many occasions, and all of us in the Bay Area were, we worked together quite often, and we knew everything that was going on in our orgs that was DSA related, and every DSA I knew had been at one time or another pulled for some other project or used for some other project. And so this was just the first time it happened was when I was called down there to get, to help work on these files for preparing for the Kisser case. And this was Cynthia Kisser versus Freedom Magazine, actually.
Okay. And since we're going to be talking about that case in some detail, go ahead and give the background and the specifics on that.
Well, in 1991, Kisser had been one of the sources in Time magazine, and she'd said some particularly true things about the church and how ruthless it is. And one of the ways the church responded was to publish an article in Freedom magazine. Yeah, it was all very trumped up, and it was nothing that really related to the Cult Awareness Network. They were just trying to tear her down.
Right. But Cynthia herself was the head of an organization called the Cult Awareness Network.
Right, exactly. And so that was one of the reasons why she was a prime target, because the church fought against Cult Awareness Network quite a lot.
Right, and for those not familiar, this is early 90s now, and the Cult Awareness Network was a real thorn in the side of Scientology because it was a group of people like Cynthia Kisser, psychologists and anti-cult activists and this sort of thing, who were organized to talk about cults and the dangerous cults and get people out of them.
Right. And they also had a hotline that people could call that concerned relatives, friends, etc., or people who were just curious about whatever this cult was could call and get information.
Right. And so here they are being a source for the 1991 Richard Behar Time magazine article about Scientology, the cult of greed, which hit the church right across the, chops. And so, of course, the church wasn't just going to go after Time magazine and Richard Behar. They were going to go after every single person who had anything to do with this article, and Cynthia Kisser was one of those people.
Yeah, she sued Freedom Magazine for libel. And the church, she sued the Church of Scientology International and Freedom Magazine for libel. And this was right about the time that the Cult Awareness Network had to declare bankruptcy, and its assets were actually purchased by a Scientology attorney. And I helped unload all of those documents from a truck one day. We came in, and there was this big tractor trailer and just full of boxes that we all unloaded so we could start going through them to look for dirt.
So here you are, and you've experienced all the things you've experienced in Scientology up to now.
Yep. And
you're not in a disaffected headspace.
Not at all.
Right? You're pro-Scientology. This stuff works.
Yep.
We're the good guys. People like her are the bad guys. So you're actually going through these documents, and people are, one thing people are going to like, how come she couldn't see that, Scientology was so bad after going through all these documents? And I'm going to ask that question. What did you think going through that stuff? What was going through your mind?
What was going through my mind was I read and saw things that I knew personally were not really true, or sort of distorted views. And one of the things that I recall specifically was there was a document which said L. Ron Hubbard taught people how to lie and control people using lies, and the source of that was from a lecture. And in the lecture, I read it, and he does say this is how lies are used as a mechanism to control people. But right before and after that, he was talking about how evil it was to do that. But that part had been conveniently taken out. And so I sort of took that and said, okay, well, these are people who would say anything negative. And some would. Some of the detractors would say anything negative, even if it wasn't really true. They would just absorb anything negative about the church and push anything positive at all away. And so it basically discredited anything that was true, right?
So in other words, they were kind of, through the fact that they were not totally duplicating or using, the bad parts of Scientology or whatever, they were sort of dead agenting themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things was they would promote that Scientology had been banned in Australia. And to me, that wasn't anything negative towards Scientology. That was a violation of religious freedom, you see. Mm-hmm. And there were other things that they would say where you have the mindset of, okay, yeah, that does happen, but we all know that's not an ideal thing, and they don't understand, all of the stuff that we went through in the Sea organization, and these long hours and low pay and stuff like that. It was oh, well, they just won't understand, right?
Right.
So we have to pretend like that doesn't happen and pretend like that's not true, because even though we know it does happen and it is true, it can't be seen by those who are outside of the church because they don't understand how important Scientology is, and that it is, going to save mankind, and our eternities are at stake, and all these really important things. So it's sort of a series of reasons why this was while this was okay. And we, frankly, I just didn't think that international management would lie to us. I didn't think that there was a reason that we would be lied to. So I thought that people were lying. I thought that some of the detractors who left were lying and were, disgruntled, exes. And I read the whole paper that there was this one professor had written about apostates. And it was a pretty long paper, and I read it, and it made sense to me. I'm like, oh, okay, so apostates, they leave and they want to justify having been involved, so they make up all this stuff and say all these negative things, right? So that was the mindset. Yeah.
And you just explained it very well, because that's exactly where my head used to be at.
Yeah. Yes. What ended up happening was we were going through all these documents, looking for things specifically that we could relate to the case. And I was one of the ones chosen to go out to Chicago for the trial itself. And this was in the summer of 1997. And so it was me and a handful of other people who went out there to work with Rick Moxon, who was the church's attorney, and as sort of paralegals, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, your baby is how old at this point?
She was probably about 7 months old. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You're getting flown across the country, and yeah. I guess it's just assumed that your husband is just going to deal with everything?
Yes. Yes. I was gone for probably a total of 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what happened in Chicago? Talk about that.
Okay. So we get there, I would say a week or so before the trial, and a couple, week or two. And I was one of the first ones there. Unfortunately, everyone else had been given, several days to a week off before they had to fly out to Chicago. I was given a day because I was told they needed me immediately out there to work with Rick. And so I got to go home for one day and then immediately fly out to Chicago. And, I had to do it. And it was frankly quite interesting to work on a trial. I felt, like I had been, hey, I got to work in this really interesting project. So I went out there and we just immediately started going through, we had to go through dozens of depositions that had been done over the years on Kisser herself, on deprogrammers, on anybody who had worked with the Cult Awareness Network. And we were looking for anything they said that could be damaging. And we also had to comb through boxes and boxes of other paperwork that we were going to submit, other evidence and documents that we were going to submit as evidence. I recall we had probably 2 bankers boxes full, and I got to be in charge of those because I sat there and spent hours and hours indexing them all, and I learned them pretty well. So I knew where all these things were, what piece said what, how to find it. And so I was kind of used as a little bit of a database for this. So I worked with Rick every day, pretty much. And,
Okay, and now, so you're working with Kendrick Moxon, attorney at large for the Church of Scientology, right? This guy's infamous.
Yes.
So what was he like?
My impression of him is that he was a true believer. He really believed in what he was doing, and he worked very hard at it. And he was willing to go to any lengths to win. He talked to me. There was another case that he had won, the one that bankrupted CAN, and it was a young man who had been abducted for deprogramming. He was not a Scientologist, though. He was like Pentecostal or something like that. And that was the case that bankrupted CAN, because they lost that and were ordered to pay him like $1.5 million or something. And Rick, basically, that was his big win. That was his big success, was he destroyed the Cult Awareness Network. And he was having a lot of problems because at the time, that young man was had gotten upset at Rick because he felt that he was just a pawn for Scientology, and he was, honestly, what Rick really cared about, he did care about the man, but he didn't care about the money. You see, he didn't really seem to care a lot about getting him his settlement. Once he bankrupted Can, his plan was to, after the Kisser suit, go after psychiatrists. That was his big thing, and that was sort of all he would talk about and think about. The problem was that the young man had turned to Graham Barry to be his attorney after Rick, and this was a huge problem, obviously.
Well, Rick, now it's not going to be so obvious for a lot of people. Who's Graham Barry, and why is that
about? Yeah, sorry. So I forget. You have to remind me. So Graham Barry is infamous in those who know in Scientology circles for fighting against the church legally. He's represented many people who the church has sued. He's probably filed some lawsuits himself, and so he is not at all liked. He's like one of well, back then he was one of Scientology's most hated. So,
really?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
they really hated Graham Barry, and Rick just really hated him a lot. And Rick had a very uncouth sense of humor, I guess you could say, and he liked to make fun of Graham Barry for being gay. And one of the things that I recall was he told a story about some letter that he'd had to write to Graham Barry for some legal proceeding, and he wrote it to Graham Ferry, and he spelled it Fairy, and he got fined for that. He got from judge, and he said it was worth it, and he was just pretty gleeful telling this whole story about how he did this, and he thought it was just so funny, and it's really just so childish and
well, it says something about Rick's, it says something about Moxon's character.
Yeah, definitely. And but yeah, so he would sort of make these snide jokes about that.
All right. Yeah. So this Pentecostal kid who was used as a pawn by the church to bankrupt Can with his case now isn't getting his money. Rick doesn't seem motivated to get him his money, which is unusual for a lawyer, but that seems to be the case. And so now this kid's looking at going to Graham Barry.
He actually did. He hired Graham Barry as his attorney. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Basically, in order to collect his money.
Right. And because he was tired of being used by Scientology for their own agenda, and Rick actually filed, from what I understand, he filed motions to against the young man about not being mental capacity to make his decisions, to hire Graham Barry, that he was under undue influence by Cult Awareness Network, etc. So. And whether Rick believed that or not, I honestly don't know. I don't think he did. I think he was just trying anything he could to desperately salvage this, because it was his big thing and he was losing control of it completely.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. Undue influence.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. Whereas
talk about the really, pot calling the kettle black.
Absolutely.
So, okay. So now you're working with Rick Moxon in the courtroom.
Yep.
Now, Heber was around?
Heber was around for most of the trial because he was representing the church. So Kisser had also sued the Church of Scientology International. So he was around for most of the trial, and we would have meetings and whatnot every evening. We'd have dinner together, all of us. It was about, I think, half dozen of us.
You said you guys were you put up at a hotel out there? Was the church paying for all the food and everything?
Yeah, we were put up in actually corporate housing that was quite nice. So one thing that they did have a lot of money for was lawsuits.
Really?
Yeah. We stayed. Yeah, right. We stayed. Well, we needed to stay between where the courthouse was and the non-Scientology attorneys, because they had to have local attorneys associated with the case, because Rick wasn't a attorney, I guess, in Illinois or whatever. But and so we had, hired this other firm, and so there had to be easy access, and it was right in downtown Chicago. So we actually stayed in this nice high rise. It was really great. The church, paid for all the food. We'd have, really good pizza a lot. That was that was really nice. There was a lot of money for that. So it was flights. People were flying back and forth constantly to fly in for testimony. Heber was, moving around a lot because he had a lot of other stuff to do. And so.
Did it ever occur to you at the time? And I'm not asking these questions because I'm trying to put you on the spot or make you wrong.
No, fine. Yeah.
I'm just curious. Did it ever occur to you? You had 7 months prior to this and had a baby.
Yes.
You'd been, on practically welfare terms in order to have the baby, because the church was not about to give you a dime towards that, and throws you up to Mountain View, sink or swim.
Yep.
Did the disparity of that ever cross your mind?
No, it didn't. It really honestly didn't. I was working way too hard, first of all. When we were there, we were working very late every day, no breaks at all. It was just constant. So no, I just didn't even I only had time to at least enjoy the fact that we had nice quarters with a nice view in nice downtown Chicago, and that's about it. Yeah, I appreciated that, but the disparity didn't. It was too much cognitive dissonance going on.
Well, exactly. And also you made a very good point there, which was you were too damn busy to even think about it. And that's, again, something that, is not generally recognized is outside of the bubble world by people who look into it is how much of your headspace is devoted to just doing what you're doing and not thinking too much about anything else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, because I imagine you guys it wasn't a 9-to-5 job that you guys had out there.
No, not at all. Like I said, we worked very, very long hours. It was, it was probably 16, depending upon the day, 16, 17-hour days, because we also had, to go to trial, and, I spent a lot of time in the courtroom during the trial and whatnot. So we all had a lot to do.
And how many other DSAs were there out there with you, or other?
There were 2 other DSAs out there for most of the time. I think it was Portland and Sacramento. And there were 2 other non-Sea Org OSA personnel. One, I think, worked in, I don't actually know what office he was working at the time. Another one who had worked in LA for a long time for OSA, when it was OSA US. And so he sort of bounced around and he'd worked with Rick a lot. I think he worked with Rick on the other case, against Cult Awareness Network and whatnot. But they were non-Scientologists. It was mostly us and Rick. And then Heber, like I said, was there for most of the trial. And some people would come and go. At one point there were like 1 or 2 people from OSA who came down to help with stuff. But
okay, and you being low man on the totem pole as a DSA paralegal, you're Sea Org, but you're out of Class 5 org, and you're out there to be paralegal. So was it sort of yes sir, yes sir, yes sir to everybody?
Not really, because it was a more casual environment than that. It wasn't. It was treated. I mean, in terms of that, it was treated as more of a team environment, I guess you can say. It was very different. It was very different.
No, that's interesting. So were you?
Everybody was very, deferential to Rick, of course, because he was in charge. He was the one who was in charge 100%, and he ran us really hard. He worked us very hard. So in fact, I remember the attorney for the other side, our attorney that were non-Scientologists, apparently commented on how hard we were working and how overworked we were. And Rick was upset that he had to handle them on that, and none of us stood up and said, "Oh, we want to do this." That was a big thing.
See.
Yeah, that was a big thing. So they commented on it, and they were pretty like, "Why are you guys all working this many hours? This is a bit, yeah."
Wow.
So, yeah. I remember that coming up. Yep.
And then he's pissed at you guys because you guys aren't going, oh no, we love working slave hours. This isn't a problem for us at all.
He absolutely did. Yeah. Yep.
Sure.
That was interesting. Yeah.
All right. Now, you had mentioned when we were talking about this earlier that Rick Moxon was not the most competent attorney.
Well, so here's what happened that made me sort of realize that. One of the most important days in trial was the deposition, or not the deposition, but the cross-examination of Cynthia Kisser. Mm-hmm. Now, the church had actually been doing really well. Our other attorney was very charismatic, seemed to be pretty well liked. We'd had really good success with the judge on getting almost no Scientology, anti-Scientology related statements said to the jury. There was a lot of work on that. And that was one of the things, and this was back in 1997, so it was before Scientology was really a known household hated word. And so in that sense, that was probably one of the luckiest things for us, was that the judge disallowed any of that. He said it wasn't relevant, and we were very successful. Our attorneys were very successful in not letting any of that get in front of the jury. And on the other side was Kisser, and we always had, I think, 3 attorneys at our table. We had Rick, and we had 2 non-Scientologists, 1 or 2 non-Scientologist attorneys. Kisser was, I think, trying to come across as, she was a mother, and I think that she honestly was very, very upset, that she had been so personally, defamed in this article and attacked very personal things. But I feel like she made pretty fatal mistake in hiring 2 attorneys herself, because if you have 2 attorneys, you're not some, poor, just defenseless, soul. You're
right. If she had just had 1 attorney at the table with her,
yeah,
the jury would have seen that.
The jury, I think, would have been much more this, the church with all these legal resources, and this lone woman who was a mother and was just trying to defend her name. And honestly, I really felt that was something that came across to the jury. And one of her lawyers was a gentleman who really would get aggressively upset in cross-examinations and examinations with Scientologists. And everybody on the Scientology side was very good at keeping any sort of negative or antagonism in check. And so we sort of came across as the nice guys, and they came across as, well, mean, honestly.
Right.
Yeah.
They were the rabid dog antagonists.
Yeah, I'll get into that a little bit more later because I'm talking about Rick. But so one of the most important days, and one of the things that we were most concerned about, was the examination or cross-examination of Cynthia Kisser. And Rick and I worked together on her cross-exam. And what we did was, he had me come up with all of these times that deprogrammers and these old cult awareness network, sort of people like Rick Ross, Ted Patrick, et cetera, who were involved in anti-cult activities. Some, truly interested in helping people out of cults, and some guys who, frankly, were probably shady characters. And the church wanted to position her with all of these people. So we spent hours and hours going through, combing, these, and what I did was I would say, okay, here's the deposition page, and then he was going to question her about all these things. I was 23 years old at the time, I think, and had never worked in legal. So it didn't occur to me what was wrong with this picture, but it absolutely should have occurred to Rick, who had been an attorney since the 70s. The next day in court, what happened was, when he started questioning Kisser about other people's depositions and the content and what they said in it, her attorney, very rightfully so, objected to her being questioned about what other people had said in a room she was never in.
Right.
It hadn't occurred to me.
Isn't that hearsay or something?
Yeah, exactly. And there's no anyone with it. Immediately I understood. And I realized that almost all of our cross-examination was gone. It was not going to be relevant. And Rick didn't immediately realize that because he got really flustered. He went on to the next thing, and it was another question about from someone else's deposition. Again, overruled. The next thing, again, overruled. And finally, he realized he couldn't keep doing that, and he was very flustered, and he had to sort of dig down and find out what he could actually question her on. And I was really quite surprised. I mean, I kind of felt fear because I had helped to do this, you know. So I kind of took my personal, like, oh my gosh, you know, I have failed.
So you'd also mentioned that Kendrick Moxon's strategy was, and this is not a Scientology specific sort of strategy in terms of legal cases, but that he had mentioned biasing the jury.
Right.
And that was going to be key to winning the case, is that you wanted to bias the jury against Cynthia Kisser, who was the one bringing the suit. So how did what rolled out with that?
Absolutely. He told all of us that, and that was the sort of the way you won these cases. And that seemed, pretty accurate from what I'd seen about jury trials, that a lot of biasing, was done. The worst thing was somehow, we would know certain things about jurors. I don't know how, and I don't know what came about, but we were told that one of the jurors' daughters, and I didn't know who it was, had been raped. And
you actually knew this about one of the jurors?
We knew this about one of the jurors, that her daughter had been raped. Yeah, and I have no idea how, but it was basically, if there was anything that could be done to, position against that. And there was something that Cynthia Kisser had said in one of her depositions about rape that would certainly cause somebody who had a child who'd been raped to be angry at her. And we found this in one of her depositions and made it known, and Heber took that and used it on the stand when he was on the stand.
Heber did what?
He took that information of what Cynthia Kisser said about rape and used it on the stand. It was some line of questioning where about the church's attitude against Kisser, and Heber said, well, she said such and such about rape, and I don't know if somebody like that should be considered a source on religion, or morals. And
wow. And this is the sort of thing that we're talking real deep legal strategy now. Like, Heber never would have gone on the stand and said that, except for the fact that there was a jurist.
Yeah. I do recall Heber specifically saying that he would have to figure out how to use that when he was on the stand. Use that piece of information about what Kisser said. And he did.
So people who think that, these guys are just going up and telling their story, and that's what happens in a courtroom. No.
There's a lot of strategy behind it. There's a lot of try and work this in, try and work that detail in, specifically to make the other side look bad and you look good. And Heber did it very well that day, I have to say. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So what was the outcome of that case, and then what happened with you after that?
It was actually the first case that the church won in a jury verdict. So the jury found in favor of the church, and honestly it was pretty arcane, because all the church had to do was prove that it believed what it said at the time, and that was pretty much it. And it was pretty clear that the church hated Kisser and Cult Awareness Network and all of that, and
right. So it was not a strong libel suit against the church.
No, it really wasn't. And Kisser's case had been really pared down to just a few statements from the whole article, to just a few statements. And so it was really sort of nitpicking over these few statements, and the jury was given some very clear things about that. And so the jury quickly ruled in favor of the church, and we won that case.
Right.
The big
and of course, giving the church legal precedent to continue to,
defame, slander
people in a public media setting, and they get away with it.
Absolutely, they do.
And it wasn't even that hard.
Right, it wasn't.
And that's, a comment on our legal system as well as on the church's deviousness.